Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and warm welcome to the audiences in here and online where you are. Thank you very much for joining us for today's seminar, and we are back for another research series on transcultural fandom studies. And today, it is my great honor to introduce Professor Renée DESJARDINS. I'm from Canada, and you all have read about Renée's fantastic academic work. And so I will just tell you some very personal story that how I came to know Renée. Basically, that when I started at HKU, one of the very few things I quite enjoyed during the COVID was emailing with Renée. It's like writing to her and hearing from her. It's like so enjoyable. It's like we were exchanging views about what social media is and how are we going to evaluate work of influencers. That's how we get connected. And over the past few years, her academic work expands really beyond the translation going digital. And today she's going to share her latest research on influencer economy and fandom. Yeah. Well, let's have a good number.
So thank you so much to Professor Dingkun. Thank you to everybody who is here today. I mean, you could be anywhere today, right? And you chose to be here, so that means a lot to me, especially coming off a 14-hour flight from Canada. So yes, thank you to the organizers, to the student volunteers. I really appreciate all of the organizing effort. I tend to drink a lot of coffee, so sometimes I speak very fast, sometimes always. So if ever I'm speaking too fast, or you want me to repeat a word, or you want me to define a word, please don't be shy. Raise your hand, I'll try to get to you. Sorry for the people online, I might not be able to get to you immediately, but we will have time for Q&A, so we can also pick up some questions at that point. So I'm a little bit like a student today. I'm going to be presenting some new material, so you can evaluate me. Fandom and fan studies aren't really my specific area. There's a lot of intersections with influencers and the creator economy, but I'm testing some new material today, so I'll be very interested in receiving your feedback. So we'll get into the presentation. Just a few notes before we begin. So the first thing that I would like to do is situate myself. I think it's really important as researchers to share our subjectivity, our positionality, because I think that that informs our research, right? So I'm an ACA fan. Maybe this is a term that you read about. If you're familiar with Henry Jenkins' work, this is a term that he put forward. So it comes from academic fan. So I'm an ACA fan of social media. I will state that I'm an elder millennial, so I came up with Facebook and some of the dominant platforms at that time. I mean, there were social platforms before Facebook, as we know, and I know that Facebook isn't necessarily as dominant in Asian countries. So unfortunately, I'm going to be speaking to Silicon Valley platforms a little bit more than, platforms like Xiaohongshu. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But I'm very curious to hear, people who are working on different platforms. I would love to have that conversation. So yes, I'm an active fan of social media, but sometimes it's a love-hate relationship, right? And to give an example of that, things move so quickly on social media, right? If we think, for example, of the platform that used to be called Twitter and is now X, almost overnight, the whole culture of the platform shifted. Access to certain information was no longer available to researchers, right? So sometimes working in these spaces can be very stressful because if we don't collect our data, in a certain way, or we don't predict trends, things can shift very quickly. So it's a little stressful to work in this area, and maybe some of you can relate to that. So a bit of a love-hate relationship. And I also acknowledge that social media is very extractivist, right? We spend a lot of time there. These platforms collect our data. So as a researcher, I'm aware of that and I don't love that. As a user, I don't love that. But at the same time, I really like free platforms and social media. So it's a bit of this love-hate relationship. Like I said just now, I acknowledge that I tend to focus on social platforms that have been developed, launched, and that are owned by Silicon Valley tech giants. And this is mostly for pragmatic reasons, because that's what I'm most familiar with and what is used in North America. But I acknowledge that there are other platforms, and that's why I'm so grateful to be here today, because I would really love to hear more about these platforms that I'm perhaps less familiar with as a user and as a researcher. And just as we can be fans of virtually anything, I would argue that we can be fans of social media, and specifically of social media creators. As Taylor Lorenz, who's a tech reporter, she covers the influencer and creator economy. She's a big name in North America. And Jeff Jarvis, who's an internet studies professor, as they state, the social internet is its users. It is us, right? Sometimes we tend to give all these tech giants, power, influence, but at the end of the day, if there are no users on a platform, is there a platform, right? So this is something that we should think about, the agency that we have on these platforms, right? And then a few more notes. I think this is shifting, but I think it's a story that is worth sharing with students. When I was in my PhD, I was told that studying Facebook would be career suicide, that Facebook was going to be a flash in the pan, that after 2 years, nobody would be talking about this platform, that social media was a joke, it wasn't serious academic work. And it is the only time that I didn't listen to my research supervisors, where I said, I kind of think Facebook's going to be a big deal. I think we should be paying attention to what's happening here. So this was around 2007, 2008. And now I think that's shifted. I think now in academia, we're seeing more academic research that ties in with these social platforms. But it's important to recall that there's kind of this association that's happened over the years where, it's some scholars have said it's frivolous, it's not serious, right? But I certainly don't take that position. The other thing too is, even let's say social media is frivolous, who cares? It's mainstream culture, and that's worthy of investigation, right? So I think it's really important to study internet cultures, fandoms, and other mainstream objects of study. Now, platforms can be difficult to define, right? They are sites of cultural production. They are technological infrastructure, kind of in the engineering and programming sense. They are markets, right? You can shop on TikTok or Douyin. You can shop on Instagram, right? So there's this commerce. And then Instagram, sorry, not Instagram, but influencers also have their own products that they sometimes sell, right? So there's different kinds of markets. Some researchers also consider platforms as geographies, right? And of course, these platforms are increasingly multilingual, and that's what we're going to be tackling today. And this is either through their affordances or the features, or because of user activity, right? It can be a combination of these things. And it's worth noting that the global influencer marketing sector of the economy in 2023 was estimated at 21.1 US billion dollars. So that's a huge market share, right? Influencers so frivolous, but at the same time, $21.1 billion, that's a lot of dollars, right? So it's important to view this as a potential market for translation and multilingual digital communication. And then the influencer and creator economy more broadly, so this is also influencers who have their own brands and market their own products, is estimated at $250 billion, right? So a very significant market sector. So whether you're looking at this from strictly an academic perspective or looking at it from a business perspective, right? There's reasons for examining internet cultures and mainstream objects of study. Quick question. Does anybody know the difference between an influencer and a creator? Because I'm going to be using both terms, but you know, as language experts, we should probably define our terms. So does anybody have an idea? Or
I think maybe an influence is that's a larger amount of content.
okay.
However, content creator can be a more generalized term for those like micro influencer or those marginalized influencers.
Right. So a creator could kind of be an everyday user, you know, maybe they have 5 followers, maybe they have 10,000, right? So it doesn't really, a creator just has like an online presence. It's almost synonymous with a user. Yeah. Okay. And then influencer would be somebody who really tries to establish that clout, that presence that's chasing the bigger follower numbers. Okay. That's a good start. Did you want to add?
And for creators, like the content creating.
Okay, that's great. That's a good idea. So kind of thinking about the level of creativity, right? So influencers are kind of marketing themselves as a product. Creators might be sharing creative endeavors, right? Like art or music or something like this. Okay, that's good. Would anybody else like to add? Okay, so these are great definitions, and I think that these are workable definitions, certainly. But I know that I've been informed that there are people in the room that have been looking at social media through a gender lens. And so I would like to share a bit of feminist history of the internet. So the term influencer was actually the term that was originally used to describe people who had a certain influence on the internet, whether they were monetizing or not. And it's important to note that this is around the early 2000s, and primarily the people who were getting influence and monetizing their content online were women, specifically mommy bloggers, right? So moms were kind of the first ones to create what we kind of now know as the social internet, and they were the ones that kind of set the template for monetization or monetizing content. So what happened was women didn't really have a forum to talk about taboo subjects like postpartum depression, chapped nipples when they were breastfeeding, right? And other issues related to childbirth and childcare. So what did they do? They went to the internet and they started writing about these experiences. Then these women realized, hey, wait a minute, we're producing content, this is labor, and we're not getting paid for it. We have to find a way to monetize this. So what they did is they started getting advertisers to support the content that they were producing, right? And that was the template for early monetization in the late 90s and early 2000s. So it's mommy bloggers. They were the original or OG influencers, right? So over the years, what happened is there's kind of this mainstream association with women being influencers, right? Like when you think of an influencer, usually the kind of template that comes to mind is a vain, narcissistic woman. She's taking selfies, she's checking her fits, right? But we know that there are male influencers as well. Now, a few years ago, when a lot of men started getting into the podcast space, they were like, we don't want to be associated with female influencers. That, you know, we're not vain, we're not narcissistic, we don't pay attention to fashion. You know, we're more serious. We're not influencers, we are creators. So that is, in a nutshell, the story of how we got from influencer to creator. Now, I use both terms interchangeably, but I think it's important to situate this terminology in a feminist history of the internet. And I can't take credit for this research. This is actually Taylor Lorenz that I mentioned on the previous slide. She was one of the tech reporters that picked up on these early trends of mommy bloggers creating the social internet that we now know. So yeah, although I do use the terms interchangeably, we can make the distinctions that the two of you shared, but there's also something gendered in this language as well. Okay, so today's talk roadmap. I'm going to be sharing a few examples of where I see fandom and the creator economy ecosystem sort of overlap. And I think the best way to do that is with examples, right? Because as much as we love theory, we love illustrative content. So I just think that's better. So that's the route I'm going to take. But if you have any questions about theories, methods, frameworks, you let me know. We can flesh that out in Q&A. So the first example will be around Squid Game. Then we're going to be talking about platforms, software, hardware, and affordances, a little bit more technical. Then we'll talk about brands, fandoms, and multilingual digital communication. So MDC, multilingual digital communication. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some takeaways and discussion. How does that sound for a game plan? We're good? You don't really have a choice. This is what I've prepared. But again, if you have any questions or comments along the way, let me know. I gave a 2-hour talk yesterday, so if my voice is cracking, it's not because I'm sick, it's just because I've been performing. Okay, so we'll start with the first example, which is an influencer's fans, Squid Game fans, and translation fans walk together into a room. We'll be examining the interplay and convergence of different fan and follower communities. So how many of you are familiar with the show Squid Game? Have heard about it, maybe watched it. Okay, so quite a few of you. So Squid Game is a show that came to North America. Again, the timelines might be a little bit different between Korea, Hong Kong, and Canada. So, but I think this is approximately a similar timeline. So in Canada and North America, the show arrived on Netflix in 2021. What was happening in 2021 that was not Squid Game? What were we doing? Yes, exactly. We were all socially distancing. We were all at home consuming a lot of content, right? So when this series aired, it was a new series, at least in North America. Everybody was excited. We were done with Game of Thrones. We were like, wee, Squid Game, something new to watch, right? So obviously a very popular show. And what was interesting was that many people were consuming this content. Monolingual users of Netflix or viewers of Netflix were consuming the content dubbed, subbed, and closed captioned, which is actually not usually how North Americans consume content. They'll prefer consuming usually English content. So this was a big shift, right? But I think that this kind of comes in a continuum following popular movies like Parasite. We'll talk about the K-pop trend. So anyways, so yes, Squid Game, hugely popular and definitely a hit with North American viewers. How many of you might be familiar with Youngmi Meyer? Okay, so Youngmi Meyer goes by the pronouns she, her, and also they, them. So I'm going to be using she, her. She is on TikTok and also on Instagram. She's a very popular Korean American influencer, but she started as a comedian and as a podcaster and then sort of, got into the influencer space. Now, she always had kind of a fan base, but what really helped her blow up is she posted a viral TikTok video. And I know the stats are very small here. You might not be able to see them, but I'll read them out loud to you. So following the launch of Squid Game, she addressed the quality of the subtitled version. We'll come back to why I'm saying subtitled. So she said, there are cultural references that are missing. There's omissions. It's not good quality, like terrible. So that was this little viral TikTok video. And I say viral because there was 2.9 million likes, nearly 53,000 comments, 145,000 shares, 145,000 saves, and then 145,000 shares. So quite a lot of engagement. Sometimes we talk about translation as being invisible. This is not invisible. This is a lot of people talking about translation, right? Some of them were translators, but a lot of them were just viewers that were multilingual and interested in the show's translation. So this propulsed Jungmi Meyer, not to say that she wasn't popular before, but this certainly propulsed her in a new public arena. Now, the reason that I said subtitles is that she posted a second video in which she said, okay, now that I've read some of the user comments, what I realized is I didn't actually watch the subtitled version. I watched the closed captioned version. So those of us who are language professionals, we know that there's a difference between subtitling, dubbing, and closed captioning, right? Now, that's not to say that there weren't translation issues, omissions, some fuzzy cultural references, but I was happy to see, personally, that she kind of course corrected and said, okay, I acknowledge that I was watching something that's different than the subtitled version. Now, going back to this idea of visibility, I want to show you some of the comments that users were sharing, right? So I talked about some of those statistics. Here are some examples of the comments, and they're anonymized, and that's because research ethics, right? Okay, so yes, please become a translator. It's a disservice to botch rich languages. Now, that's kind of funny because what isn't a rich language, right? But of course, this is with the wink to Korean. They do this all the time with Russian, too. There is so much depth that we are missing with poor translation. So interesting. Thanks for sharing this. Again, we constantly say, translation is invisible. Nobody cares about what we do. But here's somebody saying, thank you for talking about translation. This is so important. And now I'm upset. Hire an actual Korean person, fluent speaking for this, and stop dumbing down content. So people were very upset about some of these mistranslations. Now, remember that this was commentary around the closed captioned version. Even I could tell the translation and the actual dialogue weren't the same. So now people are like, oh, I'm an expert too. Let me share my side of the story, right? But more importantly to me was seeing comments like this. More. We want to talk about translation more. So to me, this really indicates that there is a public interest for translation. It's just maybe we're not always looking in the right places, right? If we think of literary translation, that's offline. We can't really document the conversations, right? Like if people read a translated book, they might say, hey, that was great. Maybe there'll be some commentary in the news. Maybe there might be something on social media now. But phenomena like this, right, is very much enabled because of online culture. So I was really happy to see, this was like my favorite one, more. So in terms of fandom, what we see is a convergence of three different fandoms, if you will. Myers fans, the people who were following her to begin with, who were fans of her podcast and her content. Squid Game fans, right? And then translation fans. Because I think we can be fans of translation, right? Those of us who are professionals, I mean, I can't see us not being fans of our profession. So sometimes we sort of abstract the fact that, we're not fans of our own, the things that we're into. So I thought that this was like a really interesting convergence of three very different communities coming together to maybe form a super fandom of people who are interested in international entertainment, who are interested in podcasting, influencers, and who are interested in multilingualism. What a cool community, right? Of course, not homogenous. People, very different backgrounds. So some key points from this example. How do we define fan? It varies. How do we delineate between fan and follower? I don't have an answer. This is food for thought. Also, how do we differentiate between fan, follower, user, and subscriber, right? You would think that if you're a fan, you would subscribe. If you're a hater, why would you subscribe, right? Nobody's going to pay to hate, but yet people do that. So it's really kind of confusing. These terms are sometimes confusing, and it's difficult to really define them clearly and neatly. So that begs the question of, do we even need to? Does it matter? right? I think in translation studies, there's a tendency of wanting to define things. That certainly comes from our language background, right? Let's define translation. Let's broaden the definition. Let's narrow the definition. These ongoing debates. Do we even really need to define these things, right? I mean, yes, I think it's important to have working definitions, but in some contexts, we need that fluidity, that malleability of concepts. Then ecosystems are amorphous. What amorphous means is they have different shapes, right? And they're not always predictable. For instance, can we anticipate where a viral conversation will go? I don't think anybody was watching Squid Game thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be a moment for translation. It's just going to blow up. There's going to be this influencer who's going to talk about translation, and then the crowd's going to go wild. I don't think we could have predicted that. So virality is a very difficult thing to predict. In some cases, ecosystems extend beyond one platform, beyond one fan culture and community. So we cannot assume fan communities to be nationally, culturally, or linguistically discrete. That means kind of circumscribed or bound by one platform. If I go back here, translation fans were on Twitter, right? They were on LinkedIn. They weren't necessarily on like podcast platforms, right? So we can't necessarily say, oh, everybody that was in this middle part was on the same platform. No, they were kind of all dispersed, right? But they came together around a cultural moment. So this is why we can use cultural moments like Squid Game and its virality, its popularity, as points of departure. But what does this mean? That means you have to be in online culture. And that's one of the love-hates that I have with studying social media, is you have to be online all the time. And that is exhausting. I mean, I'm not one to say that social media is horrible for mental health. I think it can be very positive for mental health in some contexts. But as a researcher, I get exhausted. The pace is relentless. So if you're studying in this space or researching in this space, and you want to try to find these cultural moments where you can find this convergence, it really does mean being plugged in all the time. And that's also a form of free labor that we have to think about, because while we're online studying, we're also being extracted from, right? So I think about these things a lot. I'd be curious to hear your perspectives. Cultural moments can point to instances of convergence among otherwise discrete fan, follower, and user communities, which is what I was showing on the previous slide. Now, what this also speaks to is in North American fan scholarship, there is a recognition that for a long time, English was the de facto language, right? If we studied fan communities, it was always from like English as a point of departure. And yet so much fandom is around Asian phenomena and cultural products like anime and like K-pop. So I really think that translation studies can contribute specifically to North American fan scholarship, but fan scholarship at large, because we can bring in these multilingual intercultural insights, right? Yay, TS. And I should note that the Korean wave specifically has had an impact. It's marked North American fan studies. That's when you really see this shift in North America, you know, people being very interested in K-pop, especially around 2008 and onwards. You see this shift. Oh, wait a second, different languages, different celebrities, different fashion, different music, right? So this includes K-pop, Korean films, Korean shows, Korean beauty products. And of course, I don't want to ignore other Asian precursors such as Japanese anime, but really K-pop has had a significant influence in the North American space. So of course, here are a few cultural moments, if you will. So Parasite on the left, Gangnam Style, that you perhaps, if you remember that song. It's funny, I was actually at the Elements Mall a few days ago, and you know, there's all these designer brands, and I see this shop front. I forget which brand it was, and it doesn't really matter, but it was literally like the size suit, like a gold suit jacket, and the pants and the shoes, and I was like, Gangnam Style, there it is, it's still trendy. So I thought that was pretty funny. BTS, Blackpink, and then even, this is actually a recent screenshot from Sephora in Canada, where K-beauty now has its own section in the shop. So I think that really speaks to the dominance of the Korean wave in North America. And this Korean wave has also hit translation studies that has looked at the influencer economy. Perhaps you're familiar with this article, and if you're not, and working in the space, I would recommend it. So not that I want to self-promote, this is a book that I co-edited, but ignore that fact. What I want to point out is that this is by two Korean researchers who looked at the translation in Korean beauty YouTube channels for global audiences. And this is, I think, one of the first case studies where we really saw some content coming out of the North American space and looking at Korean influencers. So this is kind of a foundational text, I would say, if you're looking at this kind of material. Okay. Any questions so far? Pace is good, not too fast, not too slow. Okay, great. So now let's talk about platform affordances and multilingual or translation features. I tend to use multilingual and translation interchangeably, and that is really for marketing. What I've found in my own work is when I'm trying to reach out to other disciplines, translation just doesn't have the same currency. People are like, oh, translation, that's when you take one language and put it into another, like a bilingual photocopier, right? We in translation studies know that that's not the case, but the average person in other disciplines just doesn't have the same kind of background information. So I think multilingual sometimes, is more, is a term that has a bit more currency and speaks to other disciplines more readily. So that's why I use multilingual. So we'll be looking at Silicon Valley and how they've been introducing more multilingual features, translation features on their platforms. Is everybody familiar with Silicon Valley? I just want to make sure, I don't want to make assumptions. So maybe just to clarify, Silicon Valley is a tech hub in the US where you have the headquarters of big tech companies like Google, like Facebook, right? So I use Silicon Valley to kind of talk about all these different social tech companies. So one of the trends that we've seen, I would say, especially in the last 3 to 4 years, is this push for more multilingualism on these social platforms. So the question is this because Silicon Valley is trying to be nice and facilitate multilingual communication? Or is this another form of extractivism? Or can it be both, right? So a little bit of theory, bear with me, it's one slide, I promise. So this is a bit of an older publication, but I think it really sets the tone for some of the terminology that I'll be using for this particular example. So in order to understand users and fans, we need to understand where they are and what tools they are using. So that means not only understanding platforms, and here platforms in the sense of the infrastructure and the cultural space, right? The two senses of platform. But it also means that we're looking at hardware, so devices like our mobile phones, and software like operating systems, because you need all of these layers in order to be able to produce content, right? And to create fandom. So this is a book called Racing the Beam, and it's actually about a video game console. So not really about social media, but some of the key concepts are really helpful for the work that we're doing here today. And I should mention that Ian Bogust, I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, he's also somebody who writes a lot about technology, virality, another important tech reporter like Taylor Lorenz. So if you're trying to kind of tap into the culture, this is another big name. So these two authors argue that computational creativity, we were talking about creativity earlier when we were defining creator, is layered and interconnected, right? So it's as much about user creativity and what platforms and tools facilitate that creativity. Now, platforms have been around for decades, and they support what we call expressive computing. Now, I don't think that any influencer is like, oh yes, I expressively compute. But yet that's what we're doing, right? We're using these tech tools to express ourselves in different creative ways. Now, platforms themselves are layered, like I said. So we have the hardware, the operating system, that's what OS refers to, the software, and then the modular components. So if you're using, I don't know, a headset or a joystick or like anything else that's like a peripheral, that comes into the modular components. Now, computer science and engineering examine how to best develop and deploy platforms. What is our job as those of us who are in the digital humanities? We look at the cultural relevance of platforms and the activities on these platforms. Now, it's interesting to note that in 2009, when this book was published, and maybe some of you might be too young to know this time, I am not. So, I mean, things have changed since 2009, but it's interesting to note that at that time, very little work, very little academic work was examining how hardware, software influences, facilitates, or constrains particular forms of expression. So I think we're still filling these gaps. And I want to give a very tangible example of this. So if we think of which languages are enabled on social platforms, we can think of a platform like Instagram. Perhaps some of you are familiar with it, perhaps not. I mean, Instagram, it's helpful to know which platform, but in the end, it doesn't really matter. But the point being, it took 7 years for Instagram to support right to left languages. So these are languages like Arabic, like Hebrew, like Farsi. So when we talk about, how software facilitates or constrains particular forms of expression, if you spoke Arabic, you couldn't readily use your language on Instagram until 7 years after the platform launched. That's pretty significant, right? That means that as a monolingual Anglophone, you always have the upper hand with Silicon Valley produced platforms because they're always designed from the outset for Anglophones. And that's pretty problematic, I would say. I mean, even though I can speak English, but I recognize that that just boxes out a lot of cultural and linguistic communities, right? So more recent examples of this. So every year around September, Apple does its big Apple launch. It talks about new devices. So this year, we had the iPhone 16 come out, which included this Apple Intelligence. And what came, or in terms of multilingual features and affordances, Apple Intelligence will now have this kind of built-in AI translation throughout the phone. However, not all languages are being rolled out and launched at the same time. So it's the same issue as Instagram with the right to left languages. Again, what are we prioritizing? English, Spanish. And interestingly, you would think that there wouldn't even be a hierarchy of Englishes, but there is. American English first, Canadian English maybe in December, right? So it's interesting to see how even within one language, we have kind of a staggered rollout. And my question is, what is so different between American English and Canadian English that we have like a 5-month differential between being able to use our specific language variant? So again, this example shows that in terms of affordances, this new type of AI translation has recently come out. It's facilitating a new kind of multilingual engagement with devices. Now, the other thing too that I would like to point out with this is this concept of technological obsolescence, which is a big fanciful term to talk about if you don't have the newest device, you're not going to have access to these features, right? So if you have an old iPhone, so sidebar, my partner has an ancient iPhone. It's, I don't know from which generation, but he can't even use iOS 18. It would just kill his phone, right? So he wouldn't even have access to this AI translation. Now, I don't think that really affects him, but there are users for who this could be significant. Crisis workers, social workers, even medical staff, right? If you want to use some of these automated translation features, you have to have the most recent device. What does that mean? We're shifting out different devices. This has ecological impacts, financial impacts, so super problematic. And this isn't exclusive to Apple products. So this is an Android example from Samsung. Pardon me, I feel like I'm yelling into the mic. Sorry if that's really loud for the people online. So here, similarly, again, this is very small. I'm sorry, I'm happy to share my slides so you'll be able to see. But the rollout of the translation features on this Samsung device, which is the most recent, similar. English and Spanish are pre-installed in the interpreter app. Additional languages require an additional free download, but translation results may vary, right? So this again is a bit problematic where, you know, if you speak some of the more dominant languages, you have access to these features more quickly. It's also interesting to note how politics or geopolitics or conflict will affect which languages show up. So I should mention in a previous multilingual update on Apple devices, Ukrainian was bumped up to the list of enabled languages. Why do you think that is? If we think about what's happening in the world, there's currently conflict, right, in Ukraine. So this is probably why that was bumped up. And that, you know, we can be a bit cynical and think, okay, this is the tech giants trying to do something benevolent, but there's probably something also extractivist in their decision making. Now, more specifically related to creator and influencer cultures, Meta, so the now umbrella term for all Facebook products, so Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, Threads, had a big event in September 25th to 26th of this year called Meta Connect. So a little bit like the Apple launch, this is where we talk about new features. And Meta was proud to announce that they were testing Meta AI translation for creator content on platforms, on its platforms, but more specifically starting on Instagram. So I'll just read this out loud because it's quite small. We're testing a Meta AI translation tool that will automatically translate the audio of Reels. So this is the short form video content. So more people can enjoy your content, even if you speak different languages. Oh, Meta is inventing translation, as if there weren't people who have been doing this for forever. So with automatic dubbing and lip syncing, Meta AI will simulate, I really find this interesting, the use of the term simulate, the speaker's voice in another language and sync their lips to match. We're starting with small tests on Instagram and Facebook, translating some creators' videos from Latin America and the US in English and Spanish. And we plan to expand this to more creators and languages. Now, is there anything in this blurb about machine translation literacy, the ecological effects of AI, anything about misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda? Imagine a creator who runs their whole platform on misinformation. Now you're giving them a tool to share that misinformation even more readily. So this is a both and situation. On the one hand, if you're, I don't know, selling clothing, sharing some artwork, right? Great, you want to reach more people. If you're creating disinformation, do we want people to have you know, more multilingual reach. I don't think that's the kind of fandom we want to be creating. I don't think, and I would argue, we don't need more fandom around misinformation and disinformation. We see how that's kind of worked out for some countries in North America. So the pros of multilingual features. Yes, great. More language diversity on major Silicon Valley platforms. Now you'll notice that I say relative because again, it's often English, Spanish, French, German, right? So it's again, diversity, but for dominant languages first. Are we going to get, for example, indigenous languages like Cree, Dene, Ojibwe as part of the mix? Probably not. And yet those are probably the languages that need to be supported the most, right? Sure, this also means a bit more content diversity. Content creators are able to extend their reach and engagement, which can create more fans and more followers more easily. So that might be a good thing. And I think that this does raise some awareness around platform monolingualism. So I've anecdotally noted some creators and influencers that I follow say, hey, I never really even thought about reaching different language audiences. So this is kind of exciting for me as a creator, right? So suddenly these creators are like, ooh, translation, that's a thing, cool. So again, translation visibility, we're out there. I think people are talking about translation, which is great. Now, the cons of these features, extractivism, right? If you're spending more time creating more content in more languages, you're giving more data to these platforms. And the fact that these the fact that these features and affordances are built into the platforms means that creators and influencers don't have to go outside of the platform, right? If we rewind to 5 years ago, people would go to Google Translate, not Meta, right? So now with this built-in Meta AI translation on Instagram, users are locked in to Instagram. They're not going somewhere else, right? Now, the other thing too is that with these features, some people are contributing to their own obsolescence, right? So if you were a multilingual creator creating in multiple languages, now these tools might be phasing out some of what made you original and cool to follow. So that's a bit problematic. Creators might not have translation literacy, let alone machine or AI translation literacy, right? So for example, if you're a monolingual creator and AI mistranslates you, you have no way of assessing that, right? What if AI hallucinates? You have no way of assessing that. So that's problematic. In massive fandoms, right? Let's imagine somebody who's creating content around BTS or Blackpink, right? They have these massive followerships, massive fandoms. Now, if AI contributes to mis or disinformation, this misinformation then propagates at scale, and that impacts fans and users. And these affordances and features are still being rolled out according to, again, central and peripheral language models. So that's problematic. I would be really interested in knowing a little bit, and we can do this during Q&A. I'd be curious to see how multilingual and translation features are being rolled out on some of the dominant Asian platforms, and if it kind of tracks with what we're seeing in Silicon Valley. So we can come back to that during Q&A. So yes, we've talked about how creators, influencers, and fan accounts generate multilingual content and how this requires an understanding of the interconnectedness of hardware, software, and platform affordances. So like I said, if you don't have Meta AI translation, maybe you're not producing multilingually. This creates a research challenge. We see that platform features evolve rapidly. So in August, nobody was talking about Meta AI translation. In October, everybody's talking about it, right? So things shift very quickly. It's also difficult to see what occurs behind the scenes, right? It's hard to say how creators and influencers are choosing to use these features and why without conducting interviews and surveys. Now, it's great to do participant-based research, but it's really hard to get influencers and creators to answer our research surveys and interviews. And if you're feeling that as a student, let me tell you, I feel it as a research supervisor. It has been a challenge. I don't think creators and influencers like to work for free, and they view answering these interviews and surveys as work and want to be compensated. And I'm like, I'm not a brand. So it doesn't work that way. So it's a bit challenging. And then we also see that it's important to conduct research across platforms because different platforms launch different features at different times for different fan communities. So we need a more holistic approach. So I think it's really good that we're doing this today. We can share some insights from these different platforms. Okay, now let's talk about a brand example. Because again, we can have fandom not only around people, but around brands. So I'd like to talk about Peloton, which is a social fitness company. Perhaps some of you are familiar, perhaps not. So Peloton is a company that came around 2011, I believe. And their idea was to bring fitness into people's homes with bikes, treadmills, equipment. But they also have this really interesting ecosystem with influencer instructors, fitfluencers. And what they've done is they've created a multilingual fan community through this multilingual networked fitness. So here you'll see this is what the app looks like. So you could choose to have English instruction, so to have your fitness class in English, in German, or in Spanish. Now the company could have just focused on that strategy, right? Subtitles, maybe some dubbing, maybe some closed captioning and some localized content. But what they did is they actually hired a number of instructors who they themselves were bilingual and multilingual. And they have an influencer presence on platforms like Instagram. So it's pretty cool because not only are they creating multilingual content for the brand, but they're creating this whole other kind of fandom on these other platforms. So just to give a few examples, there's Mariana Fernandez, who does English and Spanish, Rad Lopez, who does English and Spanish, Camila Ramon, English and Spanish, and then Eric Jaeger, who does English and German. So again, it's these three dominant languages, but still, I think that's pretty cool to have this kind of multilingual fitness content. Now, here is one of the higher ups of Peloton talking about what they consider when they go to new markets. Well, number one is we look at the size of the fitness market, the size of the fandom in that particular country. We also look at demographics. We look at the technology infrastructure. We look at the ability to partner for logistics and third-party retail. And then, of course, very importantly, we look at the dynamics of a particular market and our content offerings and whether we need to invest in market-specific content, for example, languages, right? So localization and translation is very much part of how this company and brand has expanded into different spaces. So here, can we find fitness influencers that can help us grow in a different market, create our fandom in a different linguistic market? Now, what's interesting is to see some of the pushback from fans, from these instructors producing multilingual content on Instagram. So this is, again, very small, I'm sorry, but Camila Ramon, who is right here, she produces a lot of Spanglish content and a lot of Spanish content. She's Argentinian. And so she had a number of reels where she was talking in Spanish and she did some dubbing in English, but then she started to do Spanish only for a couple of posts. And then somebody came into the DMs and said, English, please. We're in America. What is the second most spoken language in America? Spanish. The fact that somebody would even think that America is English only, problematic in its own way. But you can see that Camila pushed back, this nice is sarcastic, nice, Anglocentrism, nice, not recognizing linguistic diversity. So what's interesting about this is that the fandom that Camila has acquired is because of her fitness instruction. Like, she's not a translator, right? And yet she's now teaching her fandom about translation and language dynamics. So I think this is, again, another example where we have that convergence of different fan communities. Okay, key points from this example, and then we're nearing the end. So brands also have fandoms, right? Peloton's brand fandom extends beyond its own platform to other platforms like Instagram, where its user fans follow its instructor influencers, some of who are bi and multilingual and create multilingual content. So there's the Peloton platform, then there's Instagram, and these influencers are in both spaces. A brand's success can depend on its ability to create and manage fandom. Multilingual digital communication across platforms is thus essential, and leveraging the creator economy is important to contemporary brand fandom. That involves translation. Again, fandoms aren't homogenous, obviously, and it's an opportunity to understand Anglocentrism and multilingual pushback, which is what I was trying to show with this example here. And then, of course, case studies on international brand development through the lens of fandom and the creator-influencer economies and NDC is needed. So I think that there's opportunity to work with business schools to kind of bring in some of these insights. So comparative work across platform economies and ecosystems. So let's conclude, because I think everybody needs some time to maybe have a sip of coffee or some water. So through this presentation, I hope to have shown some links between fandoms, platforms, creator economies, and multilingual digital communication trends. I hope to have shown the importance of studying the layered materialities and affordances of fandoms, to have pointed to the transcultural and transnational nature of fandoms and platforms and how these relate to TF and NDC. I hope maybe I've shared or prompted some ideas for future avenues and addressed some methodological and ethical considerations. And I think most significantly, I hope that I've shown how crucial users, who are both fans and creators, are essential to the social internet. And so that is it for me. Thank you.